What if we saw language and cultural differences not as barriers, but as a starting point for conversation? The Japan Foundation will continue working to bring Japan and the people of the world closer together, cultivating friendship and ties between Japan and the world. We are the Japan Foundation.
Your Excellencies, Ambassador of Japan, Mr. Shigeru, Director of Japan Foundation in Madrid, Mr. Yoshida, Shoji, Professor Heitor Romana, President of the Scientific Council of ISCSP. I don't know if he's already with us, but he sent me a message that he would participate in this webinar. Professor Tosh Minohara, Professor Luís Tomé, Mr. Tiago Mauricio, distinguished guests and attendants. It is an honor to participate in this webinar on Japan's international relations, particularly Japan's international role and global strategic thinking, organized in collaboration with Japan Embassy in Lisbon and Japan Foundation and Instituto do Oriente Research Unit, who belongs to the University of Lisbon. It is also a privilege to listen to Professor Tosh Minohara, a distinguished scholar in the field of history, politics, diplomacy, and security issues of Japan, as well as two friends, Luís Tomé, one of the most prominent Portuguese experts in geopolitics and international relations of Asia, and Tiago Mauricio, a young and promising diplomat, and additionally, a former student of mine. Let me address a word of gratitude to the Embassy of Japan in Lisbon for associating Instituto do Oriente to the commemoration of the 160 years of diplomatic relations between Japan and Portugal. It should be mentioned that in Portugal, the interest for historical, diplomatic and cultural relations with Japan has overpassed the need of an approach to Japanese foreign relations. The position and role of Japan in the world, its priorities and dilemmas, the links with great powers such as the United States, China, or European Union are of paramount relevance to understanding international relations. Additionally, several facts and changes are taking place in the region and globally. COVID-19, a new president of the United States, a polemic Indo-Pacific concept, etc. Chinese growing assertiveness, just to mention a few. I am confident that our speakers will clarify our knowledge and perceptions on these and other issues. Let me say a few words to present the Instituto do Oriente. It was founded in 1989 with a multidisciplinary approach from international relations to anthropology. The fact that in the transition of the 20th century to the 21st century, to former Portuguese colonies, Macau and Timor, changed its political status was an immediate reason for research. This opened a door to develop Asian studies with a special focus on Portuguese involvement and heritage in Asia on a contemporary perspective. A small number of academics were aware of the growing assertiveness of Asia in international relations from a political, economic, and social point of view. And this was the seed to the development of research directed to several regions in Asia, from China and Southeast Asia to Central Asia and Middle East. This year, we are organizing several webinars on Asian-Europe relations in the context of the presidency, of the Portuguese presidency of the European Union. Despite the friendship between the two countries, there is a lack of Portuguese expertise in political and security issues of contemporary Japan. I hope that this webinar could be a starter for deepening the academic research on these topics. And I'm sure that this webinar will contribute to enrich opinions, views, and analysis on Japan international relations. I will pass right now the floor to Ambassador Shigeru. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and good morning or good evening for everyone. And I'm Ambassador of Japan to Portugal. My name is Shigeru, and evidently it's my utmost pleasure to be able to receive here with us today Professor Minohara from University of Kobe, distinguished investigator in the field of international law and diplomatic relations. And Japan and Portugal have a long history of friendship for more than 470 years. Since the Portuguese arrived in Tanegashima, it's what kind of a trans-territory of Japan, and being the first European to leave Japan, and last year in 2020, it was a landmark year. And when we celebrated the 160 years of diplomatic relations. On that occasion, Mr. Mottegi's visit to Portugal took place, being the first visit of the Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 18 years. Very the occasions. But Portugal and Japan share common values, namely freedom, democracy, human rights, and rule of law. Both countries are a nation of maritime trade, giving special importance to the maintenance of free and open maritime order. And these themes will be addressed by Professor Minohara, and then on to the land table. On January 1st, Portugal took over the presidency of Council of the European Union, and since then, Portugal has been actively leading the discussion on the most pressing environment, social and the governance challenges, and these difficult circumstances of COVID-19. Promoting cooperation with Portugal is also essential from the perspective of Japan-EU cooperation. Whether that today's seminar will shed light on this aspect as well. Even in the pandemic context, thanks to Japan's foundation platform in Madrid, we are able to hold this lecture online, for which I thank the Japan Foundation, the Instituto Superior de Ciencias Sociales y Políticas, the evidently precious partner of the Embassy of Japan that hosts this event. And also, I'm also grateful for the participation on the roundtable of Mr. Tiago Mauricio from Portuguese Embassy in Japan, and Dr. Luís Tomé from Autónoma Universidade de Lisboa. I hope that through this lecture and the further roundtable with active and constructive discussion, that participants will be able to broaden their view on Japan and Portugal relations. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you to His Excellency, Ambassador Ushio Shigeru, for his words and for giving me the floor. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning or good evening to all of you. My name is Shoji Yoshida, and I am the director of the Japan Foundation in Madrid. I am delighted to be here today at this special online seminar on Japan's international relations in commemoration of the 160th anniversary of Japan and Portugal's Treaty of Peace, Friendship, and Commerce. And it is a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Tosh Minohara for this event, who will be giving us a keynote speech on the matter, followed by a roundtable with Professor Luís Tome and Mr. Tiago Mauricio, whom I also wish to thank. Moreover, I would like to express my gratitude to the Embassy of Japan in Portugal and to the Instituto do Oriente of the University of Lisbon for their collaboration in hosting this timely event. The Japan Foundation is Japan's only institution dedicated to carrying out comprehensive international cultural exchange programs throughout the world. The Japan Foundation Madrid opened in 2010 as one of the 25 overseas offices of our worldwide network to cover Portugal and Spain, and it develops programs in the 3 different fields: arts and cultural exchange, and Japanese language education, and Japanese studies and intellectual exchange. With this objective of deepening mutual understanding between the people of Japan and Portugal and Spain, various activities, information services have been creating opportunities for people-to-people interactions. In this context, we are thrilled to invite Dr. Tosh Minohara, who is online with us from Kobe, Japan at this very moment. There is much to be said about Dr. Minohara, as his career as a scholar in Japan history, politics, diplomacy, and security issues is astonishing in more than one respect. But I will pass the floor for this purpose to our moderator, who will present our guests' many achievements next. The current circumstances of this pandemic do not allow us to celebrate this event face-to-face or to share a chap or sharp with a castella cake in person. Even so, I believe that this online format brings us somehow closer, as it allows us to participate wherever we are. Thus, I trust and hope that this seminar will be of interest to all of you, and that it will help further enrich and cultivate Portugal and Japan's relations in this RIIPA era. Thank you for your attention. Muito obrigado pela sua atenção.
Thank you very much. Let me present Professor Tosh Minohara. He's Professor of International Relations and Security Studies at the Graduate School of Law and Politics of Kobe University, where he also holds a joint appointment with the Graduate School of International Cooperation Studies. He received his BA in International Relations from University of California, Davis, and his PhD in Political Science and Diplomatic History from Kobe University. He is also the chairman of the non-profit organization Research Institute of Indo-Pacific Affairs, and serves as a senior advisor to CREAB. In the past, he has held various visiting appointments with such universities as Harvard University, University of California at Irvine, University of Iowa, University of Oxford, Leiden University, Stockholm University, Kuwait University, Seoul National University, Inha University, National Taipei University, Academia Sinica, and most recently, Mexico Autonomous Institute of Technology. His core academic interests deal with the diplomatic, political, intelligence, and security dimensions of United States-Japan relations from the early 19th century to the present. He has published numerous monographs, volumes, and articles, the most recent being Beyond Versailles, the 1919 Moment in East Asia. He is the recipient of the Shimizu Hiroshi Prize and the Japan Research Awards. Thank you very much, Professor Minohara. It is a pleasure to have you with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mendes, for the warm words and also the very warm welcome. I felt very embarrassed, though, because you're reading out all the universities that I have visited in the past. So it seems very apparent that I'm never here in Kobe. So I'll probably be reprimanded from my colleagues. But nevertheless, it is a tremendous pleasure to be here, to be with old friends, Luís, Tome, and Tiago Mauricio. They were very generous with their time. and have kindly offered to join this roundtable. Tiago himself represents the bridge between Japan and Portugal. When he was a young student, a very ambitious, aspiring student, and now he is, of course, a first-rate diplomat. So it's a pleasure to be with him. Luís, Tome, of course, was my connection with Portugal. He invited me to be the Halford Mackinder Chair way back when. Was that more than a decade ago? But I mean, had he not done this, I don't think I would have had an interest in Portugal. So he, you know, in your life, there's always someone who becomes a catalyst, who becomes the genesis for your interest. And in my case with Portugal, it is definitely Dr. Luís Tomé. So it is a pleasure to be with him again. Of course, I'd like to thank the Japan Foundation, Director YOSHIDA, as well as Ambassador USHIO for this kind opportunity. Now, we've already spent more than 20 minutes, so I think I better jump right in. But the standard disclaimer, of course, applies here. Even though this webinar is being sponsored by the Japan Foundation and the Japanese Embassy, I do not represent either institutions. I just represent myself and also my think tank that you see behind me, Research Institute for Indo-Pacific Affairs. So just to let you know that. And I also would like to, before I dive into my talk, just to let you know that I have visited Portugal probably about 4 or 5 times. I love the food, love the people, the weather's great. It's unfortunate that COVID has not, has made it so that we can't travel freely, because I think that I would much prefer being in Lisbon, talking to you in person, and of course enjoying good food and wine, and of course fado afterwards. And by the way, I'm a big fan of Maria Teresa. So let that be an introduction. If Ms. Imamura would kindly put up the slides for me, I'll jump right in. And okay, and maybe you can click that. Yes, thank you very much. So again, the title is Japan and Portugal. I must profess, I'm not an expert on Japanese-Portuguese history or relations, but I'm an international relations specialist, and I also look at security issues. So today, I sort of want to give you the big picture. I want to sort of cover the overall history of Japan and Portugal, and then go into the current issues, which I think will feed off into the roundtable afterwards. So next, Proxima. Okay, all right. So, I'm not going to do justice to 480 years of Portuguese-Japan relations by going over it in about a minute. But again, 1541 is the first encounter, and it's 2021 now, so we're celebrating the 160th anniversary. But there's another anniversary to celebrate, and it's the 480 years, and that's an incredible feat. As you all know, Portugal was the first Western nation to make contact in Japan. And of course, most Japanese, and I'm willing to bet that most Portuguese also remember 1543 as an important date, when either a Chinese ship loaded with Portuguese sailors inadvertently was stranded on the island of Tanegashima, and hence muskets were introduced to Japan, which became a paradigm shift in how wars were fought in Japan. And of course, this was inadvertent, but it had a profound impact on Japanese history. And I'm proud to say that last year, I finally had the opportunity to go to Tanegashima, and there's a wonderful museum there. So for those of you in this audience who plan to visit Japan eventually, please do make a trip to Tanegashima and visit that museum. It's an integral part of Portugal and Japanese history. Now, 1549, again, a very pivotal year. Francisco de Xavier was sent by, am I pronouncing this right? Is it John III, the Portuguese king? He represents Japan. Of course, Francisco is from Navarro, so he's not Portuguese, but he was sent by the Portuguese flag. Soon after, the non-bond trade begins. And we all know when we think about Portugal and Japan, it's always about non-bond. Now, the warlord back then who ruled Japan was Oda Nobunaga, and this was expanded under Toyotomi Hideyoshi. And for those of you in the audience who are not familiar with Japanese warlords, just keep in mind that Hideyoshi, his empire, when he ruled, it was centered in Osaka. And I am in Kobe, which is a city next to Osaka. And so Japan was very much centered in Western Japan. So I think when I think about Portuguese-Japan relations, to me, it's not Japan as a whole, but rather Western Japan, especially Kyushu, the southernmost island, and Portugal. Now, how did the Portuguese act? Well, basically, they acted as a middleman, a go-between between Japan and China, because the Japanese could not trade directly with Ming. So Japan's main export was silver. For Ming China, it was silk. 1557, Macau was established as a permanent settlement, and therefore, you have the trade routes are established, and most of this trade is centered in Kyushu. Unfortunately, and I've sort of skipped all the not so nice history. There were, the issues of slaveries, Japanese being sold into slavery by the Portuguese and all that, and which really impressed upon Toyotomi that the Portuguese presence, and especially with Catholicism, could be a threat. And so there's the banishing of Catholic missionaries and the restrictions of non-bond trade, although it's not outright stopped. Just to prove that, in 1603 is when you have the first Japanese-Portuguese dictionary. Now, this is an interesting time in Portuguese history, of course, because you have the Iberian Union, the merging of the two crowns, which lasts from 1580 to 1640. So, and during this period, is Japan dealing with Portugal or is it dealing with Spain? Well, what I recently learned was that a lot of the documents that were sent to Portugal or to Iberia from Japan were written in Portuguese, not Spanish. So it shows you how, in this relationship, Spain was more interested in the Philippines, whereas Portugal was interested in Japan. 1614, by this time, Tokugawa regime is out, not Tokugawa, Toyotomi, replaced by Tokugawa Ieyasu. So it's the starting of the Tokugawa shogunate. Christianity is prohibited. And this is when sort of the Portuguese dominance starts to wane because the Dutch, who are known as the Colmogin, so the Spanish and the Portuguese are known as the Nambanjin, the Dutch are known as Colmogin, and they start to come in, and so you have a rival. In 1637, you have a very large Christian rebellion, again on the island of Kyushu. This is what pretty much ends the non-bond trade because Christianity is seen as a threat in Japan. Oh, and then of course, the photograph here is, of course, as you know, is Vasco da Gama, who I have him here because I want to tip my hat to him, because had he not created the route across to Asia, there would have been no Japan-Portuguese relations. And I also had the fortune to visit his tomb within that cathedral in Lisbon. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, I don't know why these slides are changing so slow. Okay, so in the 1640s, by this time, the Dutch replaced the Portugal with trade with Europe, and it's because of Taiwan. The Japanese realized that they don't need Macau to trade with China, that Taiwan would act as a good a conduit that could replace Macau. But then the Dutch monopoly ends in the 1850s with the arrival of Perry and the Americans. And in 1854, the policy of seclusion comes to an end. So you can see how Japan is dealing with the power shifts that are taking place in Europe. Now you have the Portuguese and the Spanish, then the Dutch come, the British come, but the British are more interested in China mainland, and they got the Americans. So, Japan is pretty much, part of this great international system. So, we sort of tend to think that globalization is something new. It wasn't. There was globalization back in the day as well. It was perhaps much slower, but the world was definitely connected. In 1860, you have the Trade and Amity Treaty, which is signed with Portugal. Of course, Portuguese possessions are primarily Macau and East Timor. In World War I, 1914, both sides fight on the same side, no problem. A lot of Japanese people don't realize that 1922, when the Nine Power Agreement is signed at the so-called Washington Conference, Portugal was actually a signatory. And as you all know, the Nine Power Agreement was the major powers getting together, agreeing on how to deal with China. And so it shows you again that even in the 1920s, Portugal is seen as a power within East Asia. 1941, again, another sad chapter in Portuguese-Japan relations. The Pacific War breaks out with Pearl Harbor. Portugal declares neutrality, but nevertheless, Japan secures Timor because of its geostrategic location. Interestingly enough, Macau was never invaded. I don't know if this is true. Perhaps my fellow panelists can sort of explain more about this, but I was read that Brazil was a factor because Portugal used Brazil to threaten Japan that they would, send back all the immigrants in Brazil if Japan invades Macau. And so I don't know if the veracity of that, but that's what I read. In 1953, you have the beginning again of the second round of Japanese-Portuguese relations because diplomatic relations are restored. Now today, so I can't really sugarcoat this, but despite this historical link, I mean, nearly 500 years of relationship, unfortunately now Portugal is a minor trading partner from Japan's perspective. And even among the 27 EU nations, Portuguese ranks around 19 or 20. And so again, this is a starting point, I think. And with this, I think if you're all aware of where we are, I think we can sort of make inroads to sort of improve this, to expand the presence of Portugal and Japan and vice versa. Next slide, please. Okay, that's a changing world. Okay, so next slide. So I looked at the history of Portugal and Japan. Now I sort of want to look into what's going on now, because this is where the partnership becomes very important. The world always shifts. We know this. So you had, the period when Spain and Portuguese were the major powers. I call it Pax Namban, right? And then you have Pax Britannica, and then you have Pax Americana. So these hegemonic shifts happen. We know this. But there's always hegemonic challenges in between. These challengers who want to become the next hegemon or want to become the center of the national order but fail to do so. Such examples would be the Dutch, the French, the Germans, and the Japanese in the 1930s. Especially with the Dutch, I think if you're Portuguese, I mean, you fought wars with the Dutch, so you know how the challenger sort of attempts to change the established order. I think now we're living in a period where China is the clear challenger to the US-led liberal international order. Will this be a challenge, a mere challenge, or will China succeed in establishing the next order? That remains to be seen, and that's something we can discuss. I do believe that in this post-COVID world, I shouldn't say post-COVID because we're still in it, but after COVID, I think lines will be much more clear, and these lines will be based on values and ideology. And I guess we'll have to make a decision as to which side we're on. Recently in Singapore, there was a public opinion poll that was taken to people in Southeast Asia. And the question was, if there's a conflict between the United States and China, which side will you take? Interestingly enough, 60-some% of Southeast Asians chose the United States. Now, what's interesting is that this was a 10-point gain from when Trump was president. So it really shows you the influence or the negative influence that Trump had. And perhaps if you take a similar poll in Europe, this could be higher. But let's go back to the facts on the ground. So you have two dictators, and you can't put icing on this. You got Xi and you got Putin. And these are ambitious leaders. They want to surpass Mao and Stalin respectively. I think that we should not place our expectations on their behavior. They act the way they do because they have the reason to do so. And one of the things that concerns me is that the Biden administration will push hard on Russia because Russia is easy to push. Okay, there's no economic leverage or whatnot. So naturally, I think Russia will approach, they will align their national interests and start to be in more sync with China. And I think there's a historical precedent to this. Japan and Germany, which didn't really see it eye to eye, they sorted out their differences, and by the mid-1930s, we're much, much closer. In the late 1930s, and they formed an alliance. So, I mean, this is what I mean by lines being gradually drawn. But of course, between Russia, China poses a greater threat because, I mean, not only is he ambitious, it's the Chinese desire to be treated as a great power. And, you know, when you look at Chinese history, especially from the 18th century, I mean, it's a history of being a victim. You know, the world did not treat China fairly. And so China has a sense of victimhood. It also has a very strong sense of insecurity. But now it's an economic behemoth. And so it believes that not only should it be treated as a great power, that the world needs to accommodate its rise. But another thing has changed recently, and that is with COVID and the Western response to it, especially the United States, now China sees Western democracies as being weak, that their authoritarian system is better. So you have the sense of confidence. But then I would argue that China is also peaking power, that China's, you know, demographics is aging, you know, its birth rate is shrinking, and therefore it will peak by the early 1930s, not 1930s, 2030s. So if the clock is against you, then China needs to act now, and it needs to act in a very decisive manner to create a world order that suits its national interests when it can. And therefore, I have no value judgment based on the fact that how China acts and how China behaves. I can understand why China is doing what it's doing. But the big question is, can we accommodate China's global ambition without a major war? And as you know, when you look at these historical hegemonic shifts, they've usually been associated with war, either a regional war or a global war. What worries me is that COVID has opened a splendid window of opportunity that China is eager to seize. Again, it goes back to how we did not react properly. And I call this the carpet tempest, you know, seize the time. China's economy is growing, which is not true for most countries. But it's not growing at double digits. So I think that eventually the people will become unhappy. And therefore, this is where the nationalism card becomes enticing. You know, Putin did it when his popularity was going down. He invaded Crimea, and voila, his support rate polls went up. And I think we already see this in increased Chinese aggression in the South China Sea, Senkakus, Hong Kong. You know, that was in the news today, and Taiwan. Now, that being said, I think we all need to be realists here. I don't think we need to be emotional about any of this. I think China is not seeking, at least for now, a creation of a Sino-centric world order. So it doesn't want to be the next America per se, but it does want to create a regional sphere of influence where Americans won't meddle in, you know, that it'll be sans American interference. And so in a way, if you're familiar with Japanese history, that's very similar to, oh my gosh, what's happening here? I think I'm being cyber attacked. Okay, it's very similar to Japan's Asian Monroe Doctrine. And the Belt and Road Initiative is historical equivalent to Japan's New Order for East Asia. So what I want to say here is that it's happened once in Asia, and I think that it can happen again. And of course, history does not repeat itself completely, but it does follow similar patterns. And I think it's really important for us to sort of zoom out and look at the big picture as to see where we're headed. Okay, next slide, please. Proximo. Okay. And so here I'm just going to breeze by. So there are three types of hegemonic shifts. I call them IR tectonics. You have that, you know, outright challenge, what we're seeing now. A good example is Japan, Germany, and Italy, the tripartite pact. I mean, this was outright challenge. You have the hand-in-hand model, which is very, very, you know, it's a sparse case. It rarely happens, but Between Pax Britannica to Pax Americana, there was no war because there was a period of hand in hand from 1917 to 1945. There were shared values, similar ideology, common language. Third party rise, this does not, definitely does not apply in the world today. This is where you have the Spartans and the Athenians fighting it out, but in the end, it's the Macedonians that come in and conquer. But we don't, that case does not exist. But for the same reason, hand in hand won't happen too, because the Chinese and the Americans don't share the same values. So I think by process of elimination, the outright challenge becomes perhaps the most realistic outcome. Okay, next slide, please. And then, okay, so if we are looking at outright challenge, and how does the process move forward? Well, first of all, it usually takes place with trade. And if you are, if you follow the Pax Non-Bond period with Spain and Portugal, I mean, with the British, it was challenging, first of all, with trade. It was trade dominance. It was mercantilism. And once you garner the trade, you corner that, then you create wealth. And once you create wealth, what do you do with that? You will invest in technology. Back in the day of Spain and Portugal, it was seafaring technology. It was mask design, sales design. Right now, it's 5G, AI, quantum computing. But you already see the competition in the area of trade and technology. And also, technology is, of course, applied to the military too. You have RMA, Revolution in Military Affairs. The final phase, of course, is the geopolitical phase. And we're not there yet, but you sort of see the contours of this geopolitical rivalry that will take place between the United States and China. What I don't have here, because it's not a clash of dominance, is this is what makes things a little bit difficult and different than the past. And that is you have global issues such as climate change, in which America wants to work with China. So you have issues in which you're competing, yet you also have certain issues in which you want to work with China, which sort of creates a little bit muddled situation. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this is me with my historian's cap on, and I call it applied history. What can we learn from history? Well, first of all, before we do that, I think it's important to follow American rhetoric, because America is a nation which really moves based on public opinion. That if public opinion is critical, I mean, you don't have to refer to Walter Lippmann to sort of realize that. And therefore, politicians speak to the people, right? And in the past, the American rhetoric towards China was about China being an unfair player, trade-wise, much similar to the Japan during the 1980s. But now, in the past couple weeks, the rhetoric has changed, where you have statesmen and politicians referring to China as an adversary, an authoritarian adversary, a formidable challenger to the international order. This rhetoric, I think the shift is very interesting. The next logical step is when the United States starts to use the term enemy when it refers to China. Enemy, or perhaps like it did the Soviet Union at one point, an evil empire. Now there's this notion of being evil, an enemy. These are things that you cannot compromise, that need to be destroyed. So I think you see a gradual change in rhetoric as well. That being said, current US policy towards China is mixed. I told you about how American approaches, trade. Of course, you have technology, and I also talked about the geostrategic rivalry, but it's a mixed bag, right? You got cooperation on one hand, you got competition on the other, and then you have confrontation. The 3 C's. So this is kind of messy, so I think that nothing much, at least nothing drastic, will probably happen during the Biden administration. But the next administration, because China will be much more formidable, the United States will be forced into taking bolder action. And if that's true, then I believe the global order will become increasingly unstable. Now, I don't know about Portuguese history, but at least in Japanese history, when you have a very strong central authority, so i.e. a hegemon, starts to wane in influence, so either the Muromachi government or the Tokugawa government, then in Japan domestically becomes a period of internal warfare, becomes a period of civil war. And that's it's common sense, right? You have a strong central authority that creates a pax, a peace, but once that starts to wane, and then you have, well, all hell breaks loose. I think this could happen globally as well. Now, I believe that both the Chinese and the Americans are rational actors in the sense that they realize nobody benefits from a major war. And so, of course, the correct thing to do is to avoid a major conflict. But I think most major wars have been started through miscalculation. And so I think because of the instability, what's happening in the global situation now, that there's a possibility that the two nations could stumble into war, that it wasn't supposed to be kind of situation. I call it the, the Hitler invading Poland situation, right? It wasn't supposed to be a big war. And I think this likelihood further increases because, to me, I think Chinese rhetoric that I hear is an underestimation of American resolve and capabilities. And of course, it has a lot to do with how America handled the COVID situation. But when you underestimate somebody or a nation, I think that really reflects either subconsciously or consciously in policymaking. So this is one worry that I have. And another thing is that a lot of people, maybe, and I don't think it's just Japan, but I hear the term new Cold War being thrown out, as though if a new Cold War is an ideal situation. But we have to remember that in Asia, the Cold War was not cold, it was hot. You had the Korean War. So these are things that really worry me. In such a situation, the United States needs to depend on its allies. We are not dealing with America in the 1950s. It is not as strong. It is not, it's of course still powerful, but it no longer dominates the way it used to do. So it needs Europe and it needs Japan. And this is the key point that I want to stress, that Americans can't do it alone. In countries, Europe and Japan, of course, when I say Europe, I'm not talking about the 44 nations, but I'm talking at least a vast majority of European nations. We share values with the United States, and so does Japan. So the current and future geopolitical flashpoints, Japan was referred to as, during the pre-war period, the Prussia of the East. That's how Americans refer to China. Will China be the Third Reich of the East? And so I think as Portuguese, I think you're very familiar with European history. Was there a better way to deal with the rise of Nazi Germany? Was there an alternate path? I mean, I think these are valid questions that we need to ask, because, China is like a Nazi Germany on steroids, right? It's a much more formidable nation. So what's happening now with China, like the Xinjiang, I see it as the Anschluss, the annexing of Austria. South China Sea, I think, is like the Manchuria incident, a sudden change of the status quo. Hong Kong, I see as the Sudetenland, the Senkakus and Penghu Pratas Islands. If the Chinese go ahead and get those, it would be, like Japan invading southern Indochina. It really shifts the game. And of course, Taiwan would the casus belli. It would be, in my mind, synonymous with the invasion of Poland, right? This is it. I mean, at least that's how I think. There are some scholars who disagree, who believe that America will not defend Taiwan. I just don't see that happening. Okay, so we're almost towards the end. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so how Japan needs to respond. And I think perhaps the Portuguese audience can think about how Portugal can respond. So, we're talking about social distancing now in the era of COVID. Well, I think what we need to do is nation distancing. I think we need to reduce our economic exposure on China. China has tremendous leverage and they know it. And so the decoupling of people and goods needs to occur. This is easier said than done, but unless we do this, China has the upper hand. Also, we need to pursue a proactive free trade policy that does not place China as the hub. CTPP is critically important. I've always been wary about RCEP and the Japan-EU FTA. And this is a good start. I think that we can expand this further. Japan needs to bolster its military presence in the Senkakus. It needs to increase defense spending. Supporting maritime ASEAN is important. ASEAN is critical, and I do hope that Europe will engage ASEAN in a manner that's very conducive to stabilizing the world. And then particularly, I believe that Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines is key. So I underline maritime ASEAN because I do not see ASEAN as a monolithic bloc. It's the ASEAN that values the ocean, in which we have common strategic, we share common strategic goals. And then Japan, Republic of Korea, Republic of China, this is Taiwan triangle is important. Of course, this is very hard to do from many perspectives, but it's a goal. Japan needs to define the free and open and Indo-Pacific strategy. And it's a strategy in English, but the Japanese refer to it as a concept, very vague, is very wary of alienating China. And I think giving Quad more content. What is Quad? I don't understand what it is. It's very vague. And now Quad is talking about how to distribute vaccines to the developing world. And I'm like, what? Quad's about that? To me, Quad should be more like the pre-war ABCD encirclement, in which Japan as the hegemonic challenger was encircled by the Americans, the British, the Chinese, and the Dutch. But that's just not happening. And Japan, of course, needs to ensure that the U.S. remains committed to the region, right? And this can be done by Japan doing more for its own security. Again, linking more closely with Europe is key, especially with the post-London Declaration NATO. Okay, and there are people who are talking about creating an Asian version of NATO, and that's not going to happen. That's just too difficult, too expensive. I think it makes it a lot more practical for Japan to link more with NATO. Of course, we can talk about changing NATO's name at a certain point, but I think that is the more realistic path. Of course, restoring Japan's security identity is very important, that Japan needs to be a security provider, not a security receiver from the United States. It needs to be able to defend its like-minded neighbors, which would entail revising Article 9, right? And then the key thing is ensuring Japan's global relevancy. Japan needs to do something about mitigating its aging society and its low birth rate. And perhaps these are things in which Japan and Portugal can work on. Okay, so next slide, please. And I have no idea why this is so slow. Okay, and then final slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is where I think we put our thinking caps on, and perhaps my fellow panelists can really pitch in and help me here. When I see Portugal, I see it as an important gateway to both EU and NATO. Okay, and the fact that Portugal has the EU presidency is key here. Portugal is a nation, is a seafaring nation, which really has a very, very important historical legacy in Asia. And there are countries in Europe that don't have this legacy. And I think, therefore, Portugal has the wisdom to contribute and to shape debates within Europe about Asia. That this is something that Portugal can do. On a different level, Portugal and Japan share common basic values of liberal democracy, rule of law, human rights, and more. And I always think that not just Portugal, but Europe itself, Japanese people like to look across the Pacific and talk about US-Japan relations, but I've lived in Europe. And to me, I think that Japanese perspectives are a lot more harmonious with Europeans. This was pragmatism when it comes to either gun control, birth control, all that stuff were big issues in the United States. Even religion, right? I think the Europeans are a lot more pragmatic, and therefore, I think Japan and Europe can actually work together in trying to, well, first of all, not just prepare ourselves for the chaotic global order, but to stabilize the order itself. And finally, promoting more trade. Portuguese products, I think, are wonderful. It's too bad there's not more. And also, we need to promote more cultural and academic exchanges. And I think, as a professor, teaching at Kobe University, I think that students are by nature expert bridge builders. I have a former student who now works with the EU representative for Portugal, and she studied with me for 6 years. And I definitely believe that she's a bridge between Portugal and Japan. But we need to have more of this, because the young generation are our investment for a brighter future. And then more proactive public diplomacy. So therefore, I tip my hat for the Japan Foundation and those of others Portuguese sponsors who are here. But we need to increase mutual awareness and presence. Portugal has lots to share to Japan. And then last but lightheartedly, and I don't want to get in trouble for saying this, I have another Portuguese friend who I was speaking to yesterday, and I was asking, so what can Portugal learn from Japan? Tell me, because I need to talk about it tomorrow. And he was like, well, the Japanese are so organized, and we Portuguese are slow starters and tend to be kind of messy when we do stuff, and therefore we can learn a lot from Japan. And when I heard that, I thought it was kind of funny, because being in Japan, I always think that the Japanese need to lighten up and loosen up, because everything has to be perfect, and they'll spend so much energy in pursuing this perfection. So I think if you add Japan and Portugal and divide it by 2, it'll be the perfect combination, right? So that's something. Okay, so finally, I just want to thank you. So I got my thank you slide is my last thing, and hopefully I left enough time for my 2 wonderful panelists. Are we going to go to the obrigado page? All right, and I hope this is not, sorry, it's supposed to change in 2 seconds. So I hope this is not profanity in Portuguese. I hope that's correct.
No, it's correct.
But thank you for great attention. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Minohara, for your speech and kindness and so enlightening presentation. And now we have several topics to be discussed in our roundtable to our 2 panelists, Professor Luís Tomé. I'm going to make a short presentation of him. He's an associate professor at the Universidade Autónoma de Lisboa, and he's the director of the Department of International Relations. And as I said, he's one of the most prominent experts in Asian studies in Portugal. And Tiago Mauricio, who is a diplomat, and he studied in Japan. He joined the Portugal's Ministry for Foreign Affairs in 2015, and he was a researcher at Kyoto University and obtained a MA in International Relations from YOSHIDA University in Tokyo. So we don't have so much time. We have, half an hour. And the floor is yours, Luís Tomé. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Just let me share my PowerPoint presentation. I think you are already seeing it.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. His Excellency, President of Japan Foundation, Madrid. His Excellency, Ambassador of Japan to Portugal. His Excellency, President of the Scientific Council of ISCS, my good friend and Professor Heitor Varas Romana, distinguished chair and partners of this panel, dear colleagues and friends Nuno, Canas Mendes, Professor Tosh Minohara, and Mr. Tiago Mauricio, dear participants, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me to begin by thanking the Japan Foundation in Madrid, the Embassy of Japan and Portugal, and the Instituto do Oriente for organizing this stimulating special online seminar and for inviting me to participate in it. It is my great honor to collaborate with such prestigious institutions, as well as to share the panel with such distinguished colleagues. Thank you very much. I was listening carefully to the lecture of Professor Tosh Minohara, whom I have known personally for more than a decade, and from whom I always learn a lot. I believe that my small contribution in this session is in line with many of the ideas expressed by Professor Minohara. My talk is on Japan and the EU in world geopolitics, and I will briefly address this topic in 4 parts. The first concerns the world power structure that has changed drastically since the post-Cold War US hyperpuissance to uni by multipolar contemporary configuration, where the increasingly incomplete American supremacy coincides with several other great global powers, China, Russia, the EU, Japan, India, and also regional powers, from Turkey to Brazil, UK, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Korea, Indonesia, and so on, of which the resurgent China stands out. At the end of the Cold War, both Japan and the EU immediately tried to adapt to the new world order, seeking to be more normal and complete international players that is not only economic and technological giants, but also relevant political and strategic ones. The EU itself was only created in 1992 by the Maastricht Treaty, based on the previous European communities and developing its common foreign and security policy and common security and defense policy, and Japan pursuing a gradual strategic normalization, assuming increasing responsibilities for the security and defense of the Japanese territory and enlarging its involvement and contribution in collective security. And as during the Cold War, these EU and Japan evolutions were framed and supported by our common ally, the United States. The question is, today, in a hierarchy of power in transition and under great pressure, the tendency seems to be for a US-China bipolarization. The growth of its comprehensive national power has turned China into an emerging superpower and therefore a natural systemic rival of the United States. And in this context, Japan and the EU face common challenges. To remain both Japan and the EU relevant and influential players in the international system, to resist the pressure of growing US-China bipolarity, and therefore maintain a certain autonomy from the US, and to face the powerful challenge that China's resurgence and assertiveness represents for the international order. At the same time, the interactions between the main players have evolved towards a hybrid pattern of engagement, combining containment and engagement. Here, the main actors compete and conflict, but at the same time also dialogue and cooperate at bilateral and multilateral levels in an environment perceived as volatile and where the course of events and the behavior of other players is uncertain. Likewise, the international security complex mixes aspects of competitive security, cooperative security, collective security, and community security. Still, there are strong trends for interactions and for the international security complex to become more competitive. In fact, the main characteristic of the current security environment is the reemergence of geopolitical competition. That is, the profusion and escalation of state-based rivalries and disputes over territory, resources, and values. However, the EU and Japan reject a return to a Cold War thinking, including in the face of the Chinese challenge. China is the major challenge for the international liberal order, and it implies new dilemmas for both the EU and Japan in the equation between security and prosperity. But it cannot be addressed on obsolete conceptions and strategies, rather on the skillful balance between cooperation and competition. On the other hand, engagement is not what characterizes the EU-Japan relations. There is no competition, only cooperation, dialogue, and engagement. Both share the same values and principles on democracy, the rule of law, human rights, good governance, multilateralism, and open market economies with a logic of reciprocity. Both are major technological powers, major donors of development aid, and major advocates of a liberal international order, multilateralism, and international organizations, the fight against climate change, protecting and cleaning the oceans, or the disputes resolution through international law, mediation, or arbitration by international courts. Similarly, the EU and Japan have a broad and comprehensive conception of security in terms of threats and risks, security dimensions, and security instruments. Japan is the EU's second biggest trading partner in Asia after China, and the seventh worldwide, with a share of 3% of the EU total trade in 2019. And the EU is Japan's third largest trading partner worldwide, representing a 10.3% share of the total Japan trade. To support the trade relationships between the EU and Japan, some informal bilateral dialogues and other specific initiatives have been established. Several other important agreements have been concluded to date between the EU and Japan. Fortunately, the EU and Japan recognize each other's importance and have accelerated the deepening of their relationship in recent years. In May 2011, Japan and the EU decided to commence the negotiations for a comprehensive agreement on a wide range of cooperation in order to further enhance the relationship in a manner befitting the new era, given the changes in the international system. A total of 13 negotiation meetings were conducted until reaching an agreement, and in July 2018 was signed the EU-Japan Strategic Partnership Agreement, SPA. Under the SPA, the EU and Japan are strengthening their relations across a wide range of areas, from political cooperation to trade and investment, from development aid to digital transformation, climate action, research, innovation, security cooperation, and sustainable growth. Also in July 2018 was signed the EU-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement, RIIPA, that entered into force a few months later on 1 February 2019. The SPA and the RIIPA are connected to the formation of a new Japan area, a safe data flows. And at the early 2019, the European Commission and the Japanese government certified the equivalency of their data protection norms, brought the creation of the world's largest area of safe data flows. Data is the fuel of global economy, and this agreement is allowing for data to travel safely between the EU and Japan to the benefit of both their citizens and their economies. And in September 2019, was signed the EU-Japan Partnership on Sustainable Connectivity and Quality Infrastructure for action on digital, transport, energy, and people-to-people exchanges. There are many examples illustrating Japan-EU synergies and complementarity between their respective cooperation on sustainable connectivity and quality infrastructure with their partners. Much has been done, but there is still much that Japan and the EU can develop in their relationship for the common good and that of the world. For example, Japan's involvement in the EU missions operations and the EU participation in Asia or Indo-Pacific security, in free navigation operations exercises, and even perhaps in the Quad. Also in this respect, we must remember and follow the Japanese proposal for an arc of security and prosperity in Greater Eurasia. Defense is another area where the EU-Japan cooperation can go much farther, for example, through the joint development of certain military capabilities, systems, and equipment, and also by increasing mutual procurement. But I highlight, to finish my speech, what seems to me a crucial systemic challenge, and one where Japan and the EU must urgently work in concert to preserve and promote the liberal international order, which is under great pressure and erosion. The liberal order expanded and became universal at the end of the Cold War, always underpinned by the supremacy of the United States and its European and Asia-Pacific allies and partners. However, in the last few years, the liberal order regressed under the pressure of the major, more sovereign powers such as China and Russia, and due to the expansion of authoritarianisms, nationalisms, protectionisms, populisms, and illiberal democracies. According to the latest annual report by Freedom House, Freedom in the World 2021 marked the 15th consecutive year of decline in global freedom. The expansion of authoritarian rule, combined with the fading of and inconsistent presence of major democracies on the international stage, has had tangible effects on human life and security, including the frequent resort to military force to resolve political disputes. The dire picture is confirmed by other studies. In the 2020 edition of its Democracy Index, the Economist Intelligence Unit recorded the worst state of global democracy since the index was first published in 2006. Whereas China has been the biggest beneficiary of the post-Cold War order, Russia considers itself to be its main victim. And President Vladimir Putin does not hesitate to state that the liberal idea has become obsolete. An increasingly assertive China and a revisionist Russia are two of the main contributors to the erosion of the liberal order. They flagrantly challenge the assumptions of that order by threatening their neighbors, exporting authoritarianism, subverting democratic processes, minimizing the international rules to which they are bound, and by shaping multilateral institutions to their interest. In addition, the Sino-Russian partnership has a multiplier effect in other regions and countries, eroding the liberal order. It is in the interest of both the EU and Japan to preserve the liberal order and to put democracy back at the top of the international agenda. It is time for the EU and Japan to abandon a certain ideological neutrality and make concerted efforts to promote democracy, establishing and coordinating common value-based policies and sanction against gross human rights abusers. And in an open, inclusive, and collaborative manner with other partners, starting with our common ally, the US. And also in this respect, the EU and Japan can enhance dialogue and articulation to influence US decisions and policies. The predisposition of the US Biden administration is a great opportunity to relaunch a values-based oriented policies and a rules-based order. It is a window of opportunity that cannot be missed by the EU and Japan in a changing world. Despite the geographical distance that separates them, the EU and Japan belong to the same community of security and values, and both will gain, and certainly the world will also gain, from the deepening and of mutual relations in all areas and the strengthening of both as determined players in the international system. So, thank you.
Thank you, Luís. And now I will pass the floor to Tiago Mauricio.
Thank you very much. Good evening and good morning, everyone. I'd first like to congratulate, and with a hearty regard, His Excellency, the Ambassador of Japan to Portugal, also His Excellency, the President of the Japan Foundation in Madrid, His Excellency, the President of the Scientific Council of ISCS, Professor Heitor Barras Romana, also the distinguished professors Nuno Mendes, Luís, Tomé, and Minohara Sensei, and distinguished guests in attendance. I should first say that I could not refuse this invitation, having done my BA at ISCSP a long time ago, and having then came to Japan back in 2011 and met Professor Minohara. Simply, it was an irrefusable offer. So thank you again for the invitation. Thank you also for the Japan Foundation, the Embassy of Japan in Portugal, and the Institute Orient from the University of Lisbon for making this opportunity happen. Maybe I'll try to be fast in order to open up the debate for our guests. Just a quick remark. When I first came to Japan back in 2011, I came with a keen interest to focus on Japan's quite particular, quite unique position in the geopolitical landscape of East Asia, and indeed more broadly. Between the United States and China, there were certainly serious challenges and opportunities that Japan had to reckon with. And I feel in some way that is also the situation I'm now facing after the keynote speech by Professor Minohara and the comments by Professor Luís Tomé, so two distinguished professors in this area. So I'm in a bit of a similar situation to Japan, having to try to make use of both your speeches, and of course I will inevitably make some repetitions, but I'll try to give some more food for thought and hopefully open up the debate. So getting straight to it, the usual disclaimer applies. Of course, my opinions are my own. I don't represent the opinions of my employer, either the Embassy of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Portugal. So it's good to finish the week with some hearty discussions about some of the big issues affecting world politics. Now, looking at Japan, perhaps, I find, and this should perhaps give the framework for the later discussion, yes, of course, the alliance with the United States is still the linchpin of Japan's foreign policy. The rise of China does pose very serious structural, almost existential questions to Japan. But I think in a way, there's a growing consensus emerging with its strategic studies community, both in policy making, in think tanks, and at universities, that the result of all these tensions will be defined by four big trends in Japan's international position. First, I think it will make serious steps to continue to increase cooperation with the United States in the context of the alliance. So I think there's no way around it. This can be taken for granted. But at the same time, I don't think the US can embark on a decoupling strategy as been recommended by some specialists vis-a-vis China. I think interdependence is simply too strong, too great. And I simply, and quite frankly, don't see an interest from major stakeholders in Japan, either in government or in private sector, to really pursue a straight up decoupling strategy. I don't think that's in the cards. So between these two giants, put it simply, Japan will need to carve out a greater area for autonomy, for cooperation, for competition for sure. But I think the cards are on the table for it to play a more autonomous role within the boundaries of this competition and possibly conflict between the United States and China. Now, this said, I also see in this growing consensus in Japan a greater effort being made in diversifying its security relationships. If it was true that the United States-Japan alliance was the linchpin of its foreign policy throughout, well, since the post-war period, really, I think since the 90s, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and with the reshuffling of the regional, if not global order, Japan made an attempt within the context of the alliance to reshape its regional positioning. So that's when, in the context of the revision of the guidelines that kind of govern US-Japan alliance, there was increasing references to the alliance playing a cornerstone, playing a role as the cornerstone of regional security. So I think the strategic perimeter of Japan has certainly gone beyond its immediate territory. You can argue whether it still includes the Korean Peninsula or whether it still includes Taiwan, but definitely the strategic perimeter of Japan goes well beyond its borders. So I think we can expect Japan to play a greater role in shaping regional dynamics here between the United States and China. And perhaps fourthly and finally, Japan is also quite keen to strengthen its position in defense of multilateralism more broadly, but also to use this jargon, the defense of a rules-based international order. So I think the defense of, for instance, a free and open Indo-Pacific plays into this strategy because it highlights the importance of keeping or maintaining freedom of navigation, respecting the rule of law, defending international law, engaging cooperatively and economically with different partners, being inclusive and not exclusive. So I think this is, frankly, the strategy of a middle power that tries to squeeze in between two great players, the United States and China, in a pursuit for greater autonomy. And I think that it's here that we can certainly think about, if not really already observe on the ground, a greater emphasis on on EU-Japan cooperation. So I think the big driver between this cooperation between the EU on one side and Japan on the other, which has, of course, many signposts which have already been explained by both presentations. I think that's when the two players have really set their minds together. They've worked on some specific initiatives. The Strategic Partnership Agreement and the Economic Partnership Agreement are perhaps the umbrella documents that govern this relationship between Japan and the EU. But certainly there are others that are no less important, although maybe not as fancy and not as sexy. The Connectivity Partnership and also the this partnership for sustainable infrastructure, I think is hidden in some conceptual misunderstandings because it's not immediately clear what they exactly mean. But I think it feeds into the second big point I want to make, the first one being this growing consensus within Japan. I think the second great factor here that we need to look at, and I think one that will be increasingly important in the coming years, is the prevalence of economic factors in the reshaping of the regional and global orders. Sure, military balance of power still matters a great deal. Economic power has always mattered. But what we see recently is the national security community in Japan, in the United States, in Europe, and certainly in China, looking at more levers, more instruments of power that can enhance their position and their autonomy in order to pursue their strategic goals. We already have several examples ongoing. The definition of global and regional norms for trade are good examples. CPTPP is one clear example of very high standards defining lots of areas of economic interaction between its member states, intellectual property rights, digital, e-commerce, environment are certainly some of these key areas. RCEP has also been mentioned, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and perhaps this is a fair assessment, but not as ambitious as CPTPP, but its wide membership, including crucially China, but also South Korea and Japan, will create new impetus for the realignment of economic partnerships, for sure, economic relations, but also greater geopolitical trends. So I think this economic dimension of the geopolitical competition in the region will be very important to look out for in the coming years. Now, this feeds back into the growing consensus within Japan, because it was only last year that within the National Security Secretariat from Japan, a new unit, a new division was created to follow economic statecraft, it's called. So basically the new jargon in town is to talk about economic national security, to really precisely emphasize and highlight these new dimensions of national power that are crucial to enable everything else. We can speak about semiconductors, we can speak about AI applications, we can speak about quantum computing. So these increasingly technical expertise areas will be, in my view at least, key areas to look for in the future. Now, also to look forward to the future and also to open up the debate, maybe a third and final comment. Japan, I think, is at the crux of this regional reshaping of the order in East Asia and perhaps globally. Europe too has a role to play, and certainly Japan has expressed its willingness to cooperate with the EU and its member states to engage more broadly in regional affairs. The free and open Indo-Pacific vision or concept has been sort of the flag with which it's trying to sell its main points: the defense of an open maritime order, the defense of freedom of navigation, and all these foundational values that are shared between the EU and Japan. They've been repeated, just to present a few more examples of this. They've been repeated by the Minister for Foreign Affairs from Japan when he met the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Portugal back in September 2020, and there was a union of perceptions and positions in this regard. And this position from Japan was also reiterated. It was again repeated when Foreign Minister Motegi participated in the Foreign Affairs Council of the EU back in January this year. So I think there's a great sign of confluence of interests and values between these two players, but I think there's still a lot to be decided. If following Minohara Sensei's kind of cue back in his presentation that we need to decide which side we're on, I think that despite living in a realist world, we're still short of hegemonic competition and conflict between the two. And this is what makes our job as diplomats more interesting, of researchers as well, because it presses upon us the responsibility to think of different ways to come out of this, to see this trap. So I think there's greater role for cooperation between between Japan and the EU. The instruments are already in place. We just need to develop concrete projects to make them stick. And the next few years, I conclude, will be key to this. Just today, there was a Quad summits meeting between Japan, United States, Canada, and India. Sorry, not Canada, Australia and India. Already some concrete deliverables from that. We will see whether it develops into a formal alliance or not. I have my suspicions that it won't. If we look at the history of the Quad, it just takes the change of government in a couple of countries to really put the Quad and quadrilateral security dialogue back into the freezer. So I think there's certainly a greater degree of a risk not for it to take any further steps. But I think the next few years will be key to this. Let me also just highlight how important this will be, because from the EU side, there's interest in making concrete projects for sure. But going back to the initial point of the US-Japan alliance, I think that's where we need to look at the future developments. Both Japan and the United States national security strategies are now being revised. I think both sides are trying to push for a simultaneous exercise, because so much of Japan's defense and foreign policy depends on the United States. So I think we should definitely look for the outcomes of these two national security strategies, because they will tell how much engagement the United States will want to have in East Asia and Asia more broadly, and also how much Japan is willing to share the burden for sure, and also to take up more roles within the alliance and in the region to become a more autonomous strategic player. We know from the EU side that it too wants to be more strategically autonomous player. This is all the talk in Brussels. So we'll also have to see how much can the EU and its member states act in the Indo-Pacific region in order to make those two interests and values from both the European side and the Japan side concrete steps on the ground. So I think there's a lot to see, and I look forward to the debate to kind of explore some of these areas. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tiago. And now we have several questions, 7 questions. So I think I'm going to pick some of them, and I would start with this question. Do you think that the Japanese and Korean cultural growth throughout the world, and specifically the West, is seen as a threat to China? I think this is an interesting question. Who is going to answer? Professor Minohara?
I guess I didn't really understand the question. Is it in the Q&A? Which one is it?
It's the
second one.
The second one.
Cultural growth throughout the world. You know, I don't think China really competes in the area of soft power. And I think China is a lot more concerned about hard power. So I don't really think that China sees this as a threat per se. There was another question about soft power and anime and whatnot. When I talked about public diplomacy, I think an important component of public diplomacy is also dealing with the hard issues. And so I think this is something that, so I think Japan Foundation is slowly making the shift. The fact that I'm here and talking about this, because usually in the past it was all about, you know, anime, J-pop, all that fun stuff. But, you know, when you live in this real world, it's just not all fun. You got to look at the realities too. And so I think it's important that Japan also promotes the hard power aspect that it has. I remember this Yale professor of sociology was telling me how Japan has done a fine job of promoting its soft power, but he says, you know, in my class, the students love soft power, but they also see soft power as being, in a way, an unimportant power, you know, in terms of hard power politics. And he says Japan is far from being an insignificant power. So I think balance is important. Promoting just the soft power aspect is perhaps detrimental, would be my reply to that. And if I may add, there was that one question about the Confucius Institute. And I traveled Europe. I was just in Poland just prior to the pandemic, and I actually gave a talk in which the Confucius Institute was, you know, had their office. And, you know, it was interesting how the spread of Chinese influence. I mean, I think the Chinese, because they're well funded and transparency is not so important, have you know, they really have a great influence when it comes to impacting students and whatnot. And this harks back to the day 10 years ago when I was giving a talk in Lisbon. You know, I was at the Oriente Library, and I debated this Portuguese professor who was from the Confucius Institute, and he was, you know, vehemently pro-China and on and on and on. And you know, that's he of course you can't be negative about China if you're on the payroll of the Confucius Institute. So I really sympathize with them. But at the same time, I'm really relieved to see how far European public opinion has changed. Because, you know, I was pretty much saying the same thing 10 years ago. And a lot of people were calling me as an alarmist, that I was, you know, that I was anti-China. I mean, I was none of those things. I was just saying how I saw things. And as a historian, I've never seen a rise of a peaceful power, you know, a large power, that the international relations necessarily has to make adjustments, and these adjustments are sometimes difficult. And so I'm really glad that a lot more people see things the way I do than 10 years ago. I'd like to, of course, give the mic to my fellow panelists as well for their comments.
There is one question, the last one, from Professor Heitor Romana. He asks how Japan's foreign policy agenda deals with the build-up of a new geopolitical concept of Asia. If there is a shift from Asia-Pacific towards Indo-Pacific. I think this is a very interesting topic.
Oh no, I think definitely Luís can probably add on what I have to respond. But yeah, of course there's a shift. First of all, the Pacific Command in Hawaii is no longer called the Pacific Command. It's called the Indo-Pacific Command. And I think no one really uses the word Asia-Pacific anymore. Just as a matter of fact, 2 years ago, in the last Shangri-La conference that I attended, the Canadian Foreign Defense Minister accidentally said Asia-Pacific, and the crowd was sort of chuckling, right? Seems to be the Asia-Pacific is a word that's no longer used because you have to acknowledge the importance and presence of India. And so, you know, it's Asia-Pacific with a more expanded geographic map that we have in mind. And so, yes, I don't think we're going to revert back to Asia-Pacific. Now that, but at the same time, will India be the counterweight to China? And I don't think that's going to happen in the short term, perhaps in the longer term. But just this Quad thing, you know, we all know that India, his heart is not all there, right? India does not want to confront China because it has its own interests too. Whereas Australia picked a fight with China and is now paying dearly for it, and now wants friends, right? So even within Quad, you have, you know, different ideas, the different objectives, different priorities. So I mean, it's really messy out there, you know. I think in many ways the Soviet Union was an easier adversary to deal with, you know, because we're all interlinked with China. I don't know. So what do you think, Luís?
I think I'm not fully agree with you. In my conception, Indo-Pacific is the wrong way to define a region. We understand the motivation for these four countries. There are other countries, other governments using this framework to mention the region, but you cannot exclude a country like China from a region. And we all know that when it was created in 2007, the Quad, the idea still is contain China and maritime security. But there is no a single institution, there is not even one institution representing the region Indo-Pacific. Is a narrative, is a word to create a political reality, to create good mood between these four countries. But in fact, the best way, in my view, to refer this region is still Asia-Pacific. Indo-Pacific, there's no institutions, there's no regionalism, there's no connections between Indo-Ocean and Pacific Ocean. It's useful for political reasons, for geopolitical reasons, for India. It is obviously that is interesting for Australia, Japan, and the US having India on their side in a quid pro quo versus China. But to refer the region is not an appropriate concept. I still prefer to use Asia Pacific in this discussion. But if Mr. Chairman, my good friend Nuno, allows me, I'd like to make two brief comments on two questions.
Of course.
Yeah. One is
please do it.
Yeah.
I don't know if Professor Minohara, how is your time? You have to leave at.
I'm good. I'm good. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
One is it's related with the cybersecurity. I think one of our participants is saying that both Japan and Portugal, and in the end, the EU are doing nothing on cybersecurity. There is a lot being doing between the EU and Japan, the EU, Canada, Australia, Japan, and the US in this domain. And in 2019, the EU and Japan set up a partnership on standards for 5G, trusted services, and quantum communication. They work together to support, as they call it, a free, open, and secure internet, and cooperate closely on cybersecurity and the policies underpinning the data economy. The question is, while Russia and China is trying to create a sovereign internet, this is a kind of crazy thing, we, the EU, Japan, and the US, we are working to protect an open internet. So there are different strategies, different mindset. The other thing is related with Portugal, Japan, and Belt and Road Initiative. China is working with several tools with this Belt and Road Initiative, through Macau Forum for the Portuguese-speaking countries, dividing Europe with this China plus 17, Central and Eastern European countries plus Greece. So China is working with many different tools. But the question is, it is clear when you look for China's Maritime Silk Road, the ocean's focus component of the Belt and Road Initiative, that one of their ambitions is to control the littorals of Eurasia and large parts of Africa. One of the ways in which the Chinese are attempting to acquire that control is through politically direct economic investments through state-owned enterprises and state direct enterprises in critical ports that skirt the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, Mediterranean, and of course, the North Sea and the Baltic states. So I give you an example. In a month from now, the fate of a new terminal at the port of Sines on Portugal coast is scheduled to be decided. Sines is right in the North Atlantic. It's a very important infrastructure. And in 2012, I guess, China acquired a stake in one of the 4 terminals of the port. We are now have an international bid for a 5th terminal, which will be a 2nd container terminal. So, should we close the bid for China, for Chinese companies? I think the best way is attracting the investment from the US or Japanese companies. But we need your investment. We need you on this contest. So work together is the best way to control, contain, maintain vigilance against several initiatives. Not against directly on confrontation, closing the door, but promoting connections and attracting your investment from Japan or from our ally, the US. Thank you.
Thank you. Tiago, I don't know if you have any comments to the questions we have here. I don't know if you have read them, but the floor
I have just a very quick remark before handing the word back to Professor Minohara on this Indo-Pacific, because certainly it's attracting attention both as an expression and also as a concept with some political connotations to it. Definitely it's a narrative, but I think it reflects a deeper geopolitical perspective or project or vision, no matter how you want to say it, that was first initiated by Japan. So I think it's one of the great diplomatic successes of the last decade from the Japanese side to mainstream this expression, Indo-Pacific. Certainly as an expression doesn't serve us very much if there's no geographical definition of where it starts and where it ends, just like Asia-Pacific didn't really have one. But I think it creates the space both in policymakers, but also in intellectuals, in the public discourse, for us to open up the aperture of our analytical lenses. Because first, by emphasizing the free and open part of Indo-Pacific, it creates a space for a more third way, let's call it, between the United States and China. So in this context of greater and hegemonic competition between the two, it is definitely in Japan's interest to create a middle way, more space for Japan to pursue its own interests and values, not in opposition to Japan or China, but in providing a space, a platform for engagement with other partners. And I think that's what it's been doing for 20 years at least, even though the expression in the Pacific is much more recent than that. And I think that big success was reflected in the Trump administration, for all its evils, to adopt the same concept of a free and open Indo-Pacific. So I think this mainstreaming of the vision of an Indo-Pacific really did create extra steps that we as stakeholders can make use of, extra steps short of hegemonic competition. So I think definitely the trends are showing that there is this great power competition between the United States and China, but I don't think it's a fateful competition. I don't think we're doomed to resort to conflict in order to settle the score and to decide which side we're on. So I think we're still in the earlier stages of that competition for sure. And I think the great virtue, again, just to drive home this very important message, is that Japan, as Portugal, as the EU, is seeing great advantages in defending a free and open Indo-Pacific, because it's inclusive, so it does have to take into account China's rise and its ambitions in the region, but it sets the benchmark, it sets the rules by which this rise should take place and by which other actors should, well, indeed act in respect for international law, in a cooperative way to protect maritime navigation and freedom, and so on and so forth. So I think this third way, this platform for a greater engagement in the region, that brings in China for sure. This is in fact one of the priorities of the EU presidency, the Portuguese presidency of the Council of the EU, and that's why we'll have a EU-India Leaders Summit in May. It's precisely to engage on different terms from those being discussed between the United States and China on the way forward in the Indo-Pacific and more broadly. So I think there's definitely some political meaning to be had there with the expression, even though the geography of Indo-Pacific is still up in the air.
No, will you allow me to make a question for my friend Tosh Minohara about this Indo-Pacific?
Yeah.
May I?
Yeah. Yes.
Sorry. The question is, my good friend Tosh, it seems to me that makes more sense, for instance, to involve India in mechanisms and institutions, for instance, APEC, Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, instead of creating a narrative, but it is just a narrative. Quad, not even Quad is institutionalized. The geography is geography. Even if we divide, Europe was Europe during the Cold War, but we have Western Europe with institutions, just like NATO and European communities, and institutions on Eastern Europe. Now, the narrative for many observers and politicians using Indo-Pacific is to create an iron curtain without institutions, without involvement of other players. So in terms, again, mention the region is a mistake. It's a nonsense concept, only for political reasons. But in your perspective, why the diplomacy of these countries are not trying to involve India in the mechanisms of Asia-Pacific already created and only persist in this narrative?
You know, this is actually one of the very first debate that I've had with the Europeans about the term Indo-Pacific, because we've always used it as a given. And we all know that it's not institutionalized in any way. It's just a way to refer to a certain region, right? So I don't think I don't see it as an iron curtain. I just see the sort of expanding our view to include, like I said, acknowledging India as a future power that we should not neglect. It's the largest democracy. Of course, it has lots of work to do, but even the United States on your chart was a flawed democracy, which made me laugh. No denying that. But yeah, I mean, I think that India its population makes it really critical that it sort of shares values with us, but that's not a given. You know, we all know how fragile democracies can be, and so I think this is creating a narrative. Is sort of tipping the hat to India, that we have expectations. And of course, they may not, they go by their own interests, so they may not necessarily live up to what our expectations are. But I think India is a country with lots of potential. I've had a lot of Indian students work with me. I mean, they're all very ambitious, very bright. They speak English better than most Japanese students. So I mean, I see a lot of potential in that country, and I think it's acknowledging that. Geostrategically, and you're the expert on this. India sort of physically contains China as it, when it expands. And so I think that is, for a Japanese perspective, it was a logical partner. Looking back in World War II, before World War II, Japan was very close with the Baltic countries and especially Poland. And that was because Japan's natural enemy was the Soviet Union, and the other side was Poland and the Baltics. So I think in that similar way, Japan is reaching out to India, but beyond India is Europe. And this is where it's really important. Now, if we're going to talk about geography, one of the geography in which there's no debate is what comprises the EU. Okay, and then we're talking of, and then I guess Tiago was referring to Japan and EU, Japan and EU. And I'm sort of cautious not to use EU because a very important partner of Portugal left the EU, right? Britain. And I was talking to a friend in Northern Europe, and he was saying, we have to acknowledge that Europe just lost a major nuclear power, and therefore we now need to look at two contexts. One is that of EU, and the other is that of NATO, which Britain still belongs. So how does this work? I mean, with Britain gone, and I know there's a very rich history between Britain and Portugal as well. You guys are on the same time zone. I mean, how does this affect the big picture? Does it or does it not? And Britain has, because it left the EU, is now approaching Japan independently, with the fact that it wants to enter the CTPP, which can be an uphill battle because all the signatories, all the members have to sign off on it. But I mean, what trajectory do you see Europe going? Will it fragment more? Because we all know that Hungary has its agenda, right? So what do we see here? I mean, Indo-Pacific is great, but how about this European, the concept of Europe? Where is this shifting? Either of you.
Tiago.
Well, it's opening up another can of worms, and I did try to avoid mentioning too much of the Indo-Pacific and the EU, precisely because it does open up the space for many multiple questions. In some cases, I was careful enough to mention the EU and its member states, because some competencies still fall within its member states and not the EU as such. So in many ways, that's the perception that we hear from the Japanese side. Certainly, there are two sides to this European coin. When it serves their interest, they do mention certain European countries to open up the space for the UK to play a greater role here in security in East Asia. In some ways, they just refer to the EU because it's the umbrella term, refer to some of these mechanisms and tools, specifically the agreements, the SPA and the EPA, because that's what makes sense. So certainly there's a lot to that, at least two sides to this coin. And I think the Japanese are realistic and both realist about it. They have certain expectations about specific European countries, and they have other expectations regarding the EU as a whole. So I think we can look into more detail into which areas Japan tries to engage with Europe, and here the neutral geographic term. But I think the consensus still is that certainly Japan is accelerating its quest for more security partners, not necessarily allies. I think allies are to be found much closer to Japan, but definitely partners are to be found in Europe as such. We have overtures from the Japanese government towards the Brits, towards the French and the Germans, to speak of only a few. But I think now with the EU trying to take a more active role to devise a strategic approach to the Indo-Pacific, we'll see some of these areas that would previously and inherently fall within its member states to be scaled up, to be kind of shared more broadly within the EU as such. So I think the goal here and the challenge from our side, from the European side and the Portuguese side, I would argue, is to make sure that there's no pick and choose. We can make the most of our common assets because we share the same interests and the same values in order to present a whole package and not specific initiatives here and there where the cumulative effect won't be as strong. So I think from the Japanese side, there's this awareness to be developed that there's more to gain from a greater cooperation within the EU than just a few certain of its European countries. So there's more to be discussed, certainly. But
well, Tiago, let me just add that I'm really relieved to hear that you see a way out of the impasse between China and US, because as a diplomat, if you are gloomy and you are pessimistic, then I'd be very worried, you know. So it seems like we can avoid this doomsday scenario. So that's peace of mind. I guess the big question is, how do we do it, right? How do we do it is the big question. Yeah.
Which
Yeah, just to answer on the Brexit question and the provocation about geography. Europe is Europe. When you mention Europe, you are mentioning the continent. When you mention the European Union, we are mentioning the 27 member states of the European Union. When we mention ASEAN, we are mentioning the community of the 10 countries. When we mention APEC, we know what we are mentioning. When we say Indo-Pacific, I don't know what region I'm talking about, what region are you talking about? Concerning Brexit, I must say it is a surprise to me that we are discussing Brexit, giving no importance the major issue that the referendum in UK was interfered by Russia in the same year where Russia interfered in US presidential elections. The people and the democracies are accepting foreign intervention in elections and referendums. Probably without a Russian interference, the result of the referendum in the UK would be different. And probably in the US elections, probably would be different also. However, now we have this situation, and of course there is a huge new geopolitical situation. We have lost not only a nuclear power, but also a permanent member of the UN Security Council. On the other hand, we used to work with three major powers in the European Union, Germany, France, and UK. Now we have only two. And this, we need to recreate equilibriums, new equilibriums inside the EU. On the other hand, we have a new NATO Europe. Usually we have one major European country outside the EU and inside NATO Europe. That country was Turkey, still is Turkey. But now we have two major countries, with UK in NATO and not in the EU. So all this is mixing. And for Portugal, there is a challenge, a danger. We need to choose between mother and the father, between the EU and NATO, between the traditional ally, the European Atlantic vision, just like Portugal. This could create new problems for us inside both the EU and NATO.
Okay, thank you, Luís. Now we should finish. It was a privilege to listen to you. Thank you very much, Professor Minohara, Luís Tomé, Tiago Mauricio. Thank you very much, Ambassador of Japan and Director of the Japan Foundation. It was really a pleasure to be here and to listen to your opinions and interpretations and analysis. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
A big
good night. Good night. Have a nice day, those in Portugal.
Thank you.
We're ending our day, so.
Vai, Tiago. Um abraço também, Nuno.
Um abraço.
Bye-bye.